What is the most important year in the Galactic Empire's reign? Well, some might say 19 BBY, which marked the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. Others will talk about 0 BBY, the destruction of the Death Star at Yavin, when the Galactic Civil War finally was kicked into high gear. Others will list 4 ABY, the Battle of Endor, or 5 ABY, the Battle of Jakku, when the Empire suffered disastrous losses. But for true students of Imperial history, for individuals with more refined taste in Imperial events, they probably choose the year 5 BBY, when one single moment in galactic history completely changed the Empire's policy towards its citizens and therefore changed its relationship with its citizens. In 5 BBY, on the relatively unremarkable planet of Aldhani, a small rebel team managed to infiltrate the local Imperial Depository, stole a decent portion of the sector payroll, worth close to 80 million credits. Overall, this was an extremely daring operation. The rebels would lose several operators during the mission, and at most, they stole enough credits to buy a few frigates and maybe a wing of X-Wings. Enough to bolster the fledgling rebel fleet with some new equipment, but definitely not enough to turn the tide of the war. Worse yet, this small little attack created a massive Imperial overreaction that would change the Galactic Empire's relationship with the galaxy, increasing their security spending and draconian enforcement policies, making all future rebel activity even more costly and difficult. Which is exactly what the mastermind of this heist, Luthen Rael, wanted.
We need it. We need the fear. We need them to overreact.
You can't be serious.
So why did Luthen Rael want this overreaction? Why was this such a huge mistake on the Empire's behalf? Well, we have to first understand what life was like for the average citizen in the first 14 years of Imperial rule. Now, we all go through our own political journey in life. Many believe that such a journey starts with an awakening of sorts and then just a continuous march towards defining one's views. The truth is, however, most people's political interests wax and wanes with the tides of life, a current that is comprised of political, economic, and perhaps more importantly, personal issues. When you spend enough of your life looking at how politics affects the world and the people around you, you'll notice that in most cases, if things are going okay, if the basic needs are met and people are kept busy, usually by their work, most individuals are not engaged in politics at all. Simply put, most people just don't have time for politics, or they just aren't interested in it because that's not their thing. And if you take a look at our own world in the United States, we have this 4-year election cycle, which is a great example of the lows and highs of political awareness. Right now, we're in the middle of an election cycle, so we have tons of media coverage. We have a lot of money being poured into our political system by corporations, South African wannabe Tony Starks. And once we get through this election, if we survive, let's hope we do, the political consciousness of our country should decrease significantly, and we'll hopefully be able to go back to normal. And if inflation is under control, if there are jobs and costs of goods are reasonable, if people aren't being drafted into a war to fight the emerging dolphin threat, then once again, most individuals, I would say 70% of the population, should be relatively disengaged from politics and more worried about the mundane struggles of everyday life, like fighting your HOA because they disapprove of the low-altitude assault transport you got parked in the driveway, as if more justice, peace, and security will lower housing prices in the neighborhood. Noobs. And that is kind of the state in which the galaxy finds itself in during 19 BBY. People are sick of politics. Politics got billions of people killed during the Clone Wars. It made trillions of people into refugees, and it wiped out quadrillions more credits through lost economic activity. When there's a galactic war like the Clone Wars affecting almost every living being in the galaxy, there's very little one can do to disengage themselves from politics. Politics becomes unavoidable as separatist dropships start falling out of the sky laden with battle droids and explosives. The Clone Wars was a great period of trauma and tragedy for almost the entire galaxy. Even the Korra region wasn't completely spared. When the Battle of Coruscant unfolded, tens of thousands of ships engaged in close-quarter combat, showering the city planet with fiery debris. Although we don't have access to official numbers, I wouldn't be surprised if casualties reached hundreds of thousands, if not millions. While that's a small percentage of the entire planet's population, which is in the trillions, it still matters. I think everyone probably knew someone who got hurt or had some kind of, damage in their neighborhood. The point is, everyone in the galaxy, from the galactic elite living in the tallest spires on Coruscant to the most downtrodden wretched laborers on Ryloth, saw the consequences of the Clone Wars. This conflict became the defining moment in an entire generation, just like how World War II defined the lives of our grandparents' generation. The end of World War II led to Pax Europea, or the European peace, and perhaps that was the leading reason why the Cold War period never truly erupted into a shooting war. Hence, the individuals in charge still had fresh memories of the last terrible world war, or at least offsprings of the generation that suffered through that. In the Pacific, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution combined with an extremely aggressive cultural reform spearheaded by Hello Kitty in an attempt to change its image of kamikaze pilots and bonsai charges to something a bit more palatable. In the Star Wars galaxy, people welcome peace at any cost. Both the citizens of the Republic and the Confederacy were tired of the constant fighting and disruptions to their lives. On both sides, only the most politically hardened and extreme actually wanted to continue fighting, and they became very unpopular very quickly. Now, for the Star Wars fans watching from the sidelines and seeing the larger picture issues unfold, it might be surprising to us that most people in the galaxy did not care about the destruction of the Jedi Order and the ending of the Republic's long history. I mean, some people cared, but, for most people in the Republic, they had seen the government completely fail to prevent the suffering caused by this massive war. The Republic was grossly unprepared for the opening salvo of the war, and only through great sacrifice of the people in the Outer Rim and Mid-Rim and the Clone Army did the Republic manage to turn the tide. Even if, in the longer course of things, the Republic is incredibly important to galactic security and prosperity, it just takes one fuck-up like this to change everything. And even then, thanks to corporate greed and inefficient and corrupt central government and plenty of Sith meddling, the Republic's image had already been at an all-time low when the Clone Wars had started. I mean, this is why the Separatist crisis happened in the first place. And sadly, as important as democracy is, as the Republic was, for a lot of people who had suffered through this war, it simply was just an abstract idea, a political concept that failed them and no longer mattered. Why would you care about democracy if you've seen battle droids marching through your hometown or turbo laser fire impacting your neighborhood? Even though we all know in the larger picture, democracy and a balanced, just government system, like what a republic should be, is important. We cannot take these things for granted. A republic still needs to be maintained. You can't simply call something a republic and let it rot away from inside and still expect people to believe in it and cherish it. And so when Palpatine rose up in the Senate on that little platform after the Jedi attempted to assassinate him, this was just the latest in a line of destabilizing efforts that the galaxy was frankly tired of. They were tired of war, tired of death and destruction. They were tired of magical monks who wielded unnatural amounts of power. They were tired of insecure trade routes. They were tired of empty shelves and a lack of jobs. They wanted things to return back to normal. Republic, Empire, ideological battles between tyranny and democracy, while incredibly important, remained a luxury that only the elites could debate about in their tall spires on Coruscant, while dining on the finest delicacies the galaxy had to offer. Most likely smuggled in through black marketeers because, the supply lines were completely screwed up by the war. And so for the first decade or more of Imperial rule, people were relatively happy that Palpatine was in power. First of all, the political system is actually quite complicated. The government is quite complicated. It is a maze of bureaucracy and rules and regulations that the average person simply doesn't have a time to really understand. I mean, you have to almost specialize in understanding how government works to really have a grasp of how things operate. So seeing a powerful strongman type leader in a position of authority telling you everything is going to be fine can be quite comforting. I think despite what most people say, a lot of individuals actually don't want freedom. They don't know what freedom is. They wouldn't know what to do with it if it was given to them. I mean, take a look at so-called freedom-loving Americans. We consume partisan news that tells us how to think instead of presenting facts so that we can come up with our own thoughts. I mean, we follow consumerism. We become trapped by it. We follow trends set by celebrities and athletes and online influencers. Most people, probably like 70% of us, are followers. We don't come up with our own ideas and look to others for inspiration and guidance to tell us what to do, especially in this modern world where we're kept so busy with a lot of nonsense, that we believe we need to do in order to survive. The people who lived under the Empire weren't all that different. If anything, the Clone Wars made them fear freedom. I think a lot of these people were actually terrified of this idea of not knowing what they should do and not having someone else tell them what to do. I think there's something comforting about some larger, stronger figure just setting out how you should live your life, as terrifying as that sounds for some other people who do enjoy freedom. Now, more importantly, the early years of the Empire's reign was marked by a great effort to rebuild the galaxy. With the conflict ending and trillions of people out of work or living as refugees and struggling to make ends meet, Palpatine's most important policy, the expansion of the Imperial military and government structure, was the perfect stimulus the galaxy needed. While nationalizing resources and corporations and doling out huge contracts for reconstruction and rearmament of the Imperial military, trillions of people found work either, working directly for the government or working for private companies that were contracted to the government or enlisting in the actual Imperial military. The Clone Wars destroyed everything. It set everything back to zero. And when you're at zero, you can really just go in one direction, and that is up. And that is the kind of situation Palpatine inherited, or he created and then inherited. No matter how terrible Palpatine's policies were, it was just better than warfare. Gradually, people's lives improved. In some places like on Vardos, for instance, the Empire brought prosperity and wealth in amounts that the people on the planet had never seen, creating a genuine stronghold of Imperial loyalty. Now, if you've watched this channel, you'll know that in the long run, a military-first economy just does not work. You cannot sustain growth like this because people can't eat detonators. And proton torpedoes usually destroy more jobs than they create. And as things got more and more difficult, the Empire started taking more benefits away from its employees. It started squeezing its contractors more, and gradually all of the economic gain and benefits we see in the early years of the Imperial rule were washed away. But this was a gradual process, one that was paired by increasingly totalitarian political reform by Palpatine, who sought to bleed away power and control from the other branches of government and roll it into his own executive position.
The Empire has been choking us so slowly we're starting not to notice. The time has come to force their hand.
People will suffer.
That's the plan.
Jump into a freezing body of water and you will go into shock, and every instinct in your mind will tell you to go out. Unless, of course, you're mentally prepared and just came, out of a sauna or something. But let yourself sit in a pool of water that gradually cools down until it's freezing, and you might accidentally succumb to hypothermia, because it's gradual, and that's the whole point here. You don't notice the change. The Empire was maintaining control over the galaxy, and although it had cracked down on individual groups like the Partisans and planets like Mimbam, most people's lives remained relatively unaffected and unchanged. The biggest changes, if anything, were structural. You had the sector governance decree in 19 BBY before the fall of the Republic, which allowed Palpatine to appoint sector governors who essentially took away power from locally elected planetary system governors and sector senators. One could argue that such a position was necessary to allow sectors to function with more cohesion. Having so many different governors fighting amongst each other for resources can be kind of chaotic, and that is kind of what the Republic was like. A lot of power concentrated in the planets. The point is, the changes weren't all that significant, or at least noticeable by the average person, and in some cases these changes actually benefited people. The second biggest change was the dismantling of most planetary militias, local defense forces, and corporate security forces. Some, of course, would remain intact, but most were enrolled into the Imperial Navy, and more importantly, the Imperial Army. The idea was to shift more control from the local military into a federal military force. Palpatine wanted more power and more control, but again, such efforts don't really affect the Sith family living in the suburbs in Alderaan. Right? But then the Aldhani heists came, and this was really the last straw in a line of increasingly organized and bold attacks by the various rebel groups that were challenging the Empire all across the galaxy. Now, up until this point, there was no larger political or military structure that organized all of these various rebel movements into one cohesive body, and that was good for the Empire. Most of the disputes that the Empire faced were locally concentrated and due to the policies and corruption of the local Imperial officials. You had marauder groups like Enfys Nest, who were actually created in response to the Crimson Dawn, who just happened to be attacking supply lines of the Empire. The Crimson Dawn would also become an anti-Imperial group under the leadership of their new leader, Kiara. You then had groups like the Partisans, whose core fighters were Onderonian dissidents who had refused to join the Imperial Army. Then there were more secretive groups like Axis, supported by Mon Mothma, or Bail Organa's own rebel movement, which was focused on acquiring resources and building safe houses and infrastructure for a larger rebel alliance in the future. The point is, none of these groups are really united in purpose or ideology, and they're kind of just all pulling in different directions without kind of uniting their resources or strategy. And so they weren't effective. In most political movements, revolutions, you have the extreme fringe, the ideologically motivated, who were the first to move no matter what, but they represented just a small portion of the population, and these groups I mentioned were the extreme fringe. Luthen Rael understood that you can't really start a large revolution and overthrow the Empire with just the extreme fringe. You needed more people. This is why he wanted the Empire to overreact. He wanted them to overstep the line so much that their policies began affecting the average person, so that they had to start fighting back as well. Once you start having day laborers, teachers, lawyers, just taxi cab drivers revolting as well, then the Empire has a problem. So how did Palpatine screw this up? Well, it came in the form of several major policies.
The following measures will be adopted empire-wide as of today. Tribute tax equal to 5 times the amount stolen from Aldhani. will be levied on any sector harboring partisan activity.
Collective punishment of an entire system where rebel activity happens is just not a good idea, because these fines will take away from the local budget, which is usually used to improve the lives of the local citizens. I know, there are a lot of people out there who believe that punishment is the best way to get people to do things, but punishment can only do so much. And the hope here is that this type of punishment will make the local citizens blame the rebel groups for their suffering. The truth is, it takes a lot of effort to connect A to B to C. What a lot of people are actually going to see is that the Empire is taking money from their local government, and that is cutting services. Less services means a decrease in living standards in the local area, and that will cause more dissidents. So this is probably not a smart move. Collective punishment rarely creates the intended effects the policymakers wants it to do. As a matter of fact, usually the opposite happens.
The use of any local custom, festival, or tradition as cover for rebel activity will trigger permanent revocation of imperial tolerance.
Again, very specific and collective punishment, which in the short run might draw some ire against the partisans who launched this attack and caused this kind of crackdown, but in the long run, the Empire is just going to turn away people who are potentially neutral or even loyal to the Empire. I'm sure there were plenty of Donnies who celebrated the Mak'ani Bray Donnie event, but we're also thankful for the Empire's establishment of the Enterprise Zone in the Lowlands, which created new housing and factories, jobs. While some Donnies yearned for a return to the old way of living, I'm sure others appreciated clean running water, steady food, and paychecks. And now, because the Empire is enacting this heavy-handed policy, which prevents Aldhanis from celebrating their religion and holiday, this will only lead to more dissidents, when there otherwise wouldn't be. It's incredibly stupid.
I spoke with Emperor Palpatine last night, and he's assured me that the ISB will be taking the lead going forward.
So the ISB, or Imperial Security Bureau, is an agency that a lot of hardcore Star Wars fans might be familiar with. What a lot of people don't realize is prior to the Aldhani heist, this was still a relatively small organization with limited amounts of power and resources. See, a lot of people compare the ISB with organizations like the CIA or like Mossad, but it's actually a little bit different, because the ISB is not a national intelligence agency like these other agencies, which ideally should not be aligned to a specific political party within those countries and is supposed to serve the state. I said ideally, right? The ISB was not a national agency, but actually a part of COPNOR, or Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, which was Palpatine's own political order. So the Empire actually had dozens of intelligence agencies, just like we have in the United States, and the ISB was just one of those agencies, but they were a politically aligned and indoctrinated intelligence agency, aka Palpatine's personal intelligence agency. And so in a lot of ways, the ISB is more similar to the Gestapo Party, which was an intelligence agency or secret police aligned with the Nazi Party. The distinction here is that because the ISB is so directly connected to Palpatine, there are really no checks and balances to their power, as they were basically doing whatever Palpatine wanted them to do.
No one in this room should have trouble accessing army or naval resources in future. The Emperor will be convening an emergency session of the Senate to propose a legislation package of bills and amendments that will free our hands in all matters of surveillance, search, and seizure.
So it's from this point on, the ISB officers, who were essentially politically indoctrinated civilian analysts, were allowed to commandeer entire Imperial military units, ground forces, Star Destroyers, and use them to pursue whatever objectives they were after. Again, these guys are not in the military. They are not military trained. They probably don't really understand what kind of capabilities these military units are taking over have. As we see with Deidre Miro's takeover of the Ferrex operation, this leads to a lot of problems. Miro understands how to read intelligence and investigate crimes, but she doesn't necessarily have the skills to lead a crackdown of an entire city and pacify dissidents. You see, Palpatine went into this direction because he realized that the Imperial Army and Imperial fleets were ill-suited to crack down on a bunch of guerrilla fighters. He was essentially using a hammer to wipe out bacteria, which just doesn't work very well. What he needed was something far more precise, something that wasn't tied up in bureaucracy and politics and more rigid thinking.
We are healthcare providers. We treat sickness. We identify symptoms. We locate germs, whether they arise from within or have come from the outside. The longer we wait to identify a disorder, the harder it is to treat the disease.
But giving the ISB unchecked amounts of power, letting them just commandeer military units, led to a lot of problems. I mean, war is difficult enough with the high emotions and dangers that are prevalent on the battlefield. You need some sense of discipline, order, and structure to prevent tragedy from happening, or prevent your troops from just massacring everyone and causing war crimes. And so when you come up with these, cockamamie ideas that are not really well thought out and put civilian analysts in control of battlefield units, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to see gross misuse of impersonal personnel, a lot of cruel and unnecessary suppression of the local populace, which really has one effect, and that's not getting rid of rebels, but actually creating a lot more of them. To make matters even worse, the Emperor would also pass PORD, a policy that has an even larger impact on the average civilian.
We will be invoking the Public Order Resentencing Directive later today.
Any criminal act with even indirect effect on the Empire will henceforth be branded a Class 1 offence. All prison sentences are immediately re-evaluated. All outstanding fines and levies are to be paid in full.
So PORD is really the icing on this entire bullshit cake. This is what, in my opinion, took the scales for the Empire and took it from a poorly managed dictatorship that people tolerated to a completely vicious totalitarian state that people needed to fight in order to live. Once again, passing laws that aren't well thought out, that are all encompassing like this, leads to unfair arrests and sentencing, like what happened to Andor. I mean, he was actually a criminal, but they caught him for the exact wrong reasons. When you detain people who are innocent or who haven't committed a crime and you throw them into a system, you essentially radicalize otherwise upstanding imperial citizens, which is a bad thing. The justice system is designed to keep society stable. When it isn't functioning properly, it causes civil unrest. If random people are just being given maximum sentences for what essentially are petty crimes, that's not good for anyone. Like, what if you accidentally park illegally on imperial property? Does that become a Class 1 offense, aka a felony? That is not only going to piss off the individual who's thrown into a labor camp, it's going to piss off their family as well. And then resentencing, aka lengthening the prison time for certain crimes, is another crazy thing to do. To make matters even worse, these policies were also levied because the Empire was actually looking for free labor in their prison colonies, as we see on Arcana 5. So essentially what's happening here is Emperor Palpatine realized that his really stupid military-first economy is running out of steam, manpower, and money. And so he shifts to the next phase of his plan, where he introduces the construction of a massive police state designed to fill the prisons with free labor. I mean, what did he think the end game was going to be here? That the citizens of the galaxy would just quietly wait as the list of crimes against the Empire grew longer and all-encompassing until even breathing the wrong way gets you sentenced in a maximum security labor colony? Some people in the ISB understood all of this.
You're not pleased.
We're playing straight into their hands.
Whose hands?
The rebels. This is exactly what they want. We're treating what happened at Aldhani like a robbery.
What would you call it?
An announcement.
But you don't rise to the top in the Empire by telling the truth. You rise up by kissing people's asses. And so it was at this point the Empire went from a slow, steady decline to just free fall. I think Palpatine was so power hungry that he failed to realize that he was really at his best when he was constantly being placed in check by the Jedi and the Senate, the Republic's government system. Once he removed all of his enemies, he became lazy, complacent, and just surrounded by idiotic yes-men who failed to point out that his path was one towards disaster and ruin. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video about the Aldhani heist, which I consider one of the most pivotal moments in Galactic Empire history. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.